I'm George Galloway.
And I'm Adam Gary.
Together we are the History Boys, every week looking at an era, at an epoch, at a personality, at an event or series of events that have helped shape the world that we live in today. Because if you don't understand how we got here, you'll never work out how we get out of here. And appositely, today we're talking about the European Union, Adam, which we are in, but trying to get out of. At least some of us are. In fact, just for full disclosure, I campaigned as a 21-year-old in the 1975 referendum, which confirmed British membership of what was then the common market, but which ineluctably, as we predicted, became the European Union, a putative European state with an army, with a leadership, with a parliament, and so on, none of which met many democratic tests. At least that's how it looked to me. I was a runner in that campaign, literally a runner, for Mr. Benn, Mr. Foote, and of course other great left-wing luminaries like Barbara Castle, Peter Shore, and many other big figures on the left were leaders of the campaign to stay out of the common market. It wasn't quite as comfortable in the 2016 referendum where I was that luminary. There were no left-wing luminaries other than me in the vanguard of that 2016 referendum, which meant that the luminaries were people of the right, some of them of the far right, which was a very uncomfortable place to be. Of course, in a referendum, it's a binary choice. You're either in or you're out. You're going to find yourself on the same side as all kinds of peculiar people, or at least it's peculiar that you're on their side. Well, of course, the issue of the European Union, European unity, is much older than 1975. And who better to talk us through how the European Union came into being, why it came into being, what its true character is, the ontology of the European Union, than the professor himself, Adam Gary. Adam, tell us about the European Union.
Well, the concept of European unity long predates the European Union in a specific
Hitler
sense.
had an idea or two about it.
As did Julius Caesar, as did Charlemagne and other Holy Roman emperors who, as Voltaire said, were neither holy nor Roman, and after a while they ceased to be emperors in any meaningful way. You, of course, have Napoleon Bonaparte and the French revolutionaries that preceded him. You had Adolf Hitler, but in that period between Napoleon and Hitler, you had someone who's typically and quite correctly pointed to as the metaphysical, spiritual father of the modern European Union. And this is a man called Count Richard van Coudenhove-Kalergi. Say that 3 times fast.
Easy for you to say.
Of course. And he was the author of something called Pan-Europa, where after seeing the horrors of the First World War, where everyone agreed that they were bad, but no one could agree on how to stop them from being repeated, and indeed no one succeeded in stopping them from being repeated. He proposed the idea of a common Europe where the identities of nationalities within the European continent would give way to the modern European man. And we've heard a lot of this. He came at it from an aristocratic liberal perspective. Hitler talked about the Aryan man that would subsume his position before all others. The Soviet Union talked about the modern Soviet man from a leftist progressive angle. So all these ideas were floating in the ether at the same time, and unlike Hitler, who got to put his ideas to the test, and they worked up until he invaded the Soviet Union, then they of course collapsed underneath the boots of the Red Army. The Soviet Union put them to the test until they collapsed in the 1990s after the events that we talked about in a previous episode. Recommended viewing indeed. And Kalergi's plan didn't get to go into effect until the 1950s, until after the war. And I will just put an asterisk there. If one goes to a search engine and writes in Kalergi plan, you find all sorts of conspiracy theories, none of which bear too much of a resemblance to his plan. His plan was essentially an elitist fairly effeitist plan to have everyone just subscribe to the liberal ideology and become Europeans almost mystically. But the conspiracy theories point to something much more violent at hand, which simply isn't true. And I say this as someone who's more critical of Kalergi than I am anything else. But the defamation that you see about him online simply isn't true. He was an awkward character in a way, the son of an Austrian aristocrat and a Japanese mother. So very fascinating.
Very
indeed.
exotic.
And so you don't need to make much up. The truth is actually much more exotic than some of the fiction, but I digress. After the Second World War, we have two figures that become the important people who got their hands dirty in terms of actually doing the work to form what would become the European Union. This was Jean Monnet and Robert Schumann, no relation to the composer of the 19th century. Monnet initially took a fairly Clemenceau-style line about the Germans, that essentially Germany could only recreate its industry, and this is West Germany, of course, that we're talking about. They could only recreate its industry if it was under French ownership and French political stewardship. This was where the US and France had a bit of a convergence in terms of what they wanted. The US wanted Germany to West Germany, we have to say, to reindustrialize as rapidly as possible, because the US had plans to immediately normalize West Germany in order to make it the ground zero for the Cold War against the Soviet Union and its Eastern European allies, who would in 1952 form the Warsaw Pact as a response to NATO. Robert Schumann had a different idea. He thought we can't nationalistically say there's going to be a German coal mine under French stewardship, but instead we're going to form the European coal and steel community, where you have a common market for the steel and coal producers of Western Europe. Hence we see the organization that is the direct forebearer of the modern European Union, which is the European Coal and Steel Organization of 1952, and this featured the founding six, as they're called: France, West Germany, Italy, Belgium, the Netherlands, and Little Luxembourg. These same countries in 1956 would sign the Treaty of Rome, which created the European Economic Community, in Britain frequently referred to as the Common Market. This was really the beginning of the European Customs Union, a free trading organization that aimed to have a common tariff policy in terms of its interactions with the outside world, and a market where goods could flow freely internally.
Well, there's nothing wrong with a common market from my point of view.
Indeed.
There's nothing wrong with you and me deciding that neither of us will charge any tariffs or place any barriers in the way of each of our products or services. That seems to be well within the rights of a sovereign state to negotiate. But it went much further than that, didn't it?
It went much further than that, and there were antecedents from the very beginning. The United States was very keen on a European Union that modeled itself on an Atlanticist position, meaning instead of the generally francophone phenomenon of a fortress Europe that would be able to be a superpower in and of itself, one that wasn't reliant on the USSR, not reliant on the US. China wasn't a factor then, boy it is now, as we'll get to soon. And hence, American officials, and especially the American intelligence agencies, wanted Britain desperately to be in the European Union because
France was slightly Americophobic. It had refused to join the command structure of NATO. Although a member of NATO, it was not under American orders in NATO. It had a strong communist party. Yes. Led by a very charismatic leader, Mr. George Marchais. It had a policy that was considerably more independent than the other countries in the common market, didn't it?
Absolutely. Italy was still something of an economic basket case after the war. West Germany was a Coca-Cola colony of anti-communism at the time. Britain was still basking in the afterglow of this Churchillian concept of transatlanticism, albeit there was a huge spat in 56 when the US and UK disagreed over Britain, Israel's and France's intervention, illegal intervention, I should say, into Nasser Tsarist Egypt. But nevertheless, the American intelligence agencies still saw British membership of the common market as being crucial to acting as a fulcrum to leverage out the Gaullist tendencies of France, which, as you correctly state, were very Amerosceptic, to put it diplomatically. As such, Britain tried under Harold Macmillan to join the common market in 1961, and Charles de Gaulle precise
three knowns.
because he knew what the Americans were up to with Britain. And then Harold Wilson, a Labour man who himself was privately Eurosceptic but went along with let's join the common market. I couldn't imagine such a thing happening today. Tried again a few years later against the wishes of his own party members, and of course he got the same answer from Charles de Gaulle. Now, even then, the common market, the EEC, was vastly less united than what we see as this monolithic EU today. But the wheels were in motion, and one of the strongest advocates for a more united and a more political Europe, contrary to what he said in public, because we now know what he said in private, was a man called Ed Heath. And Heath came to power in 1970 as the leader of the British Conservative Party.
Alas, I remember it well.
Indeed. And unlike Macmillan, who was of an older generation, Heath was a committed Europeanist. He really did believe it. Was he sincere about how much integration his envisaged Europe would entail? Yes, I believe he absolutely was deceitful about that. But did he ever hide the fact that at a philosophical and, dare I say, metaphysical level, he thought of himself more as the European man of Killarney than as a traditional British Prime Minister? I think the answer is absolutely yes.
Well, I of course, witnessed all of this. I witnessed him joining. It was only possible, by the way, given the existence then as now of a substantial anti-EU minority in the Conservative Party. It was only possible by a mass defection, betrayal actually, of the Labour position by the Labour right, the Blairites of their day. I think 77 of them, if I recall correctly, crossed the floor and voted with Ed Heath. If not, he wouldn't have got the entry into the EEC through Parliament.
Absolutely, because then, as it is now, it was an issue that divided the parties. On the Conservative side, there were those who thought without a free trading agreement with our closest neighbours, many of whom reindustrialised after the war far quicker than Britain, because, ironically, while Britain got loans they had to pay back from the US, the European countries that rejected communism got free money. They got gift aid in the form of the Marshall Plan. No wonder they reindustrialized after the war more quickly. So that was the line that a lot of Conservatives had. Others, as probably best represented by the controversial but nevertheless unmissable figure of Enoch Powell, thought that the British sovereign state was going to be undermined by a political union. And much of what he said, irrespective of one's views on his other very controversial statements, much of what he said in terms of political integration turned out to be correct. On the left, you had people like Peter Shaw, a man whose name should be spoken of much more, who, along with the more famous in the long term Tony Benn, argued that membership into this EEC was inherently undemocratic, that after centuries of the British left fighting for reform bill after reform bill to expand the franchise and ultimately give universal suffrage to the male and female working class, that it would be thrown away by handing these powers over to technocrats who were not only out of touch with the democratic will in their own countries, but certainly couldn't relate to the long history of trade unionism and organization among the British left. Then, of course, there were the so-called moderates, these Blairites of their day, who thought, well, it's hopeless without the EEC, the economy will never make it, and we need to join the Tories not to have a conservative style or a neoliberal style common market, but to influence them with our moderate centre-leftist tendencies. Again, these clarion calling cards that one heard in 73 were very similar to that which we hear now. To Labour's credit, however, while Ted Heath did not give the public a choice on whether they wanted to enter the EEC or not, Harold Wilson did in 1975, and a fairly comfortable majority,
Yes,
did
it was,
vote to
yeah.
remain.
Yeah, and it was, I recall it well, that summer of being a runner in that campaign. There were, although it was a binary choice, there were, of course, more than two political positions running in the campaign. There were a league, small l, of empire loyalists whose idea fix was that Britain belonged in the English-speaking Commonwealth, that we would be turning our backs on Australia, New Zealand, apartheid South Africa, and to an extent on our special relationship with the United States, and that we felt here in these islands, which I think happens to be true and still true today, not particularly European. We recognize, of course, geographically we're part of the European continent and were once part of its landmass, but the existence of these islands separate from the European mainland and with our own traditions, culture, language, and so on, are actually quite different from them. That was one train that was running in that campaign. Another, which you could say was represented by Mr. Benn, Mr. Foote to some extent, and certainly felt by me, was that we wanted a Britain that was independent of both the United States and Europe. We wanted a socialist Britain that would feel far more affinity with the Soviet Union and the rising countries like China and India and so on. And there were those, I would put it this way, it remains true today, who lost all confidence in our country, lost all confidence in our people, who imagined that we needed to be part of the EU in order to be civilized, in order to be successful. In other words, that we were not actually capable of doing it for ourselves. Is that, as a historian, how you view it?
I actually think that Edward Heath actually could fit into that category. Even though he was a part of the war effort, as most leading politicians of that generation in fact were, where some people left the war experience thinking we can never again turn our backs on the rising authoritarianism capable of being produced in Europe. He took a different view. He thought that Britain was essentially part of the problem, just as Germany was and just as nationalists in France were, and that the only solution was for a centre-right, some would say centre-left liberal, these terms conflate to the point of meaninglessness, that only that kind of Europe could civilize the region, and that Britain was in need of being civilized just as much as Germany. That was Heath's view. And many people on the moderate end of the Labour Party and on the Heathite end of the Tory Party did in fact believe that.
Yeah, there were two sides of the same coin. So just because of the time which is marching, we had then a common market that was effectively run by technocrats, as you put it. But then that morphed into a period where the EU was not a common market run by technocrats, but a putative superstate run by people who effectively wanted to exercise political power without accountability.
Indeed, and there were several things that led to this. In 79, you see the creation of a European Parliament, which still doesn't have that much power other than to ratify what the unelected council presents. But nevertheless, when you have a parliament whose members are being elected by the nation states that are part of what was then the EEC, it begins to feel more like a state. Then in 1986, Margaret Thatcher was one of the leading advocates of a single European market that would allow for not only the free movement of goods, as is typical in a free trading area and most customs unions, but also the free movement of goods of services and capital. That was very important for the financial industry that Thatcher advocated, and which you at the time opposed very much when you entered Parliament during the Thatcher years. Then in 1992, the European Union, as we more or less know it today, was born, and the father was called the Maastricht Treaty. This was the treaty of the European Union, to call it by its formal name. Then, at the beginning of the 2000s, you have the Lisbon Treaty. It was once known as the EU Constitution, which took the steps towards political unity that were outlined in the Maastricht Treaty even further. And now we have today a system where we have a European Union that wants to consolidate ever more, wants to unify ever more, wants to be taken seriously like a state, both internally and in the wider world, more than ever before. But there's a growing disconnect amongst various peoples and various regions of Europe against these centralizing trends.
Yes, not just here. Let me take you back and ask your advice. The Maastricht Treaty was opposed by the entire labour movement, left, right, and centre. I know I stayed up all night, many a night, trying to block it in Parliament. Mr. Corbyn and I, under the leadership of Mr. Benn, we were effectively guerrilla fighters in Parliament against it. How did it come to pass that the holy cows of Maastricht and Lisbon became the holy cows of most of the labour movement? The General Secretary of the TUC, the leadership of the Labour Party, now incant the words single market, customs union, as if they were their ideas, rather than ideas that they had comprehensively fought against at the time they were coming into being.
I mean, it was Margaret Thatcher who stood next to her rival Heath in 75 campaigning for Remain. It was Thatcher who in 86 was for the single market right before she decided that things had gone too far. But she was late to that sort of strata of conservative thinking in Britain. So the answer to your question, two men. One, Jacques Delors, and two, Tony Blair. Delors became the leader of the EEC and EU in the late 80s, early 90s, and he realized that in order to get stubborn Britain on board this project, he needed to co-opt the left, which had been the most strident and most consistent voice in Britain against the EEC and later the EU. He promised that, the European Union would protect your rights as workers in ways that would stop Thatcher and future Thatcherites from doing so. And it was a bit like the Pied Piper selling the British left a bag of goods. Of course, the EU has been all neoliberal ever since then, but Delors was a master salesman in that respect.
Delors is long dead, but for many in the labour movement, it's as if he were still astride us, like a colossus.
Well, there's someone who is astride us, like a kind of colossus, who I know you will do everything you can to bring down to size because it's vastly required, and that man is Tony Blair. Tony Blair is a fanatical European. I don't know if he felt it at an emotional level like Heath. Heath, and you can watch some of his interviews.
He was, by the way, elected to Parliament for the first time on a manifesto to withdraw from the European
under Michael
Union.
Foot.
Under Michael Foot.
But Tony Blair
he showed all the signs of believing in it.
We're going to withdraw from the EU in 30 minutes. Yeah, a great promise.
Yeah.
So Blair became a fanatical European for a variety of reasons. One, because he's an egotist, and I think that ruling one country and running it into the ground wasn't enough.
Yeah.
He wanted to be he wanted to be the next Napoleon, and he thought that joining this European project, being able to lie as slickly as he has proved that he has been able to do, was clearly his goal. His other reason was because he felt no affinity towards any traditional political movements in Britain, not the leftism of yourself or of Tony Benn or of Michael Foot, not even the kind of centrism of people like Hugh Gateskill, and certainly, while you could argue that he was a kind of Thatcherite, he thought that he was even better than that. He thought that he was sort of Margaret Thatcher meets Napoleon with Caesar-like ambitions, and
we must draw that. That would be a totally wonderful image.
We should call Gerald Scarf and have him do it once.
Yes.
But that's so Blair was essentially anti-tradition in every sense. He was the new man. He was this European. And frankly, what began as Kalergi's idealistic vision of the new European ended in the Blairite vision, this nightmare. Tony Blair is the new European. And that's one of the reasons that this project frightens me so.
And yet, no one ever accused Mr. Blair of being unself-conscious. He is, politically speaking, a narcissistic figure. But he appears unaware that, in a way, though the most zealous of supporters, and I presume now funders, are certainly the organizer of other people's funds, for Britain, even at this late hour, to remain in the EU, he is at one and the same time the biggest liability, I'd go so far as to say, to the European cause. If Tony Blair is trying to sell you something, you almost certainly don't want to buy it.
That's absolutely true. And while he's gone back and forth between London and Brussels innumerable times in the last few months.
In the middle of the British states negotiations.
And indeed, the current British Prime
Some
Minister...
might call it treason.
Theresa May came close, but she didn't say that exactly. Others may, others have, and others will. But the thing with Blair, and I think it's symptomatic of the European project in general, if Blair is the iconic figure of this project, and even those who for various reasons still want to support it are distancing themselves from Blair, I think that's symptomatic of the project's own failure. The EU flag and Tony Blair's face are largely inseparable in the political memory of anyone who's been paying attention to European and British affairs in the last 25 years. And yet, while the European flag remains, its torchbearer is seen as a liability, and yet there is no one to fill those shoes. I think that itself is emblematic of the fact that the project has gone too far. I speak as someone in favor of free trade. I think Trump's nationalistic protectionism borders on lunacy, and it's certainly economic madness, but political integration beyond well-recognized states is simply fanciful. What you need to do is create prosperity between nations to create peace among nations. You cannot simply put a technocrat in charge who acts like Napoleon without the charisma. And that's what a post-Blair European world would look like. And it's being rejected from Finland to Portugal, from London to Lombardy, from Athens to Amsterdam.
Well, we're going to return to this because it's even now not yet clear, as we come to the end of 2018, that we will, after all, be leaving. Whether we leave in disarray or whether we leave at all are questions for 2019.
Indeed.
I've been George Galloway.
I've been Adam Garrett.
And together we are the History.